Good morning to our viewers in the US. Good afternoon to our participants in Europe. My name is Paul Linnartz.
And my name is Sarita Hagre. Welcome to our midterm election debrief. This today is the first of two online events we'll be having to discuss the outcome and implications of the US midterm elections. Within the next 50 minutes, we'll cover the American perspective on the results from our Washington, D.C. office. And after that, we'll hand it over to our European office in Brussels for another round of discussion to discuss the European perspective.
Another exciting, turbulent, and sometimes honestly tiring midterm election is over. It's actually not over yet because right now, this morning, we do not even know the final results for Congress. And we are facing at least one runoff for Senate election in Georgia. But just to give you an idea how massive this election cycle was, it was not just about Congress. We had 35 seats in Senate, 435 seats in the House of Representatives, but also 36 governor races, 30 races for lieutenant governor, 30 attorney general races, 27 secretary of state races on the state level, of course. In 44 states, we had some further roughly 180 high-ranking government officials, like, for example, treasurer, controller, auditor, natural resources commissioner, superintendent of schools, insurance commissioner, agriculture commissioner, labor commissioner, and public service commissioner for the election. And in 88 chambers of the parliaments on the state level, this election was about 6,300 plus minus representatives to vote for. Plus, at the end, 7 seats or 7 Supreme Court justices or High Court judges on the state level in 25 states. Incredible. Many observers consider these to be the most decisive midterm elections since decades. And this is true, I would say. We've seen a very, very high voter interest already since months, and some regions already report a record high voter turnout. Apart from that, also the campaign broke records, with billions of dollars having been spent, plus minus numbers differ, but plus minus 10 billion at least. This was the most expensive midterm election campaign ever. We saw a lot of young people taking part in these elections, and we had a lot of female candidates who were very successful in this election cycle. And this also needs to be mentioned. It was a peaceful election night in the US. To dive into all of this, or at least to analyze a few aspects for these midterm elections, we are fortunate to be joined by 2 esteemed experts. Jeffrey Kabaservice is the Vice President of Political Studies with the Niskanen Center here in Washington, D.C. He has been, among other positions, visiting assistant professor at Yale University, a visiting fellow at the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College, and research director for the Republican Main Street Partnership.
We're also fortunate to be joined by Patrick Ruffini, who is the co-founder of ECHELON Insights, a next-generation polling, analytics, and intelligence firm. Patrick has worked for the RNC and on the George W. Bush re-election campaign. As the founder of the agency Engage, he's advised political campaigns nationally and internationally, as well as the advocacy and nonprofit community.
Before we jump into the discussion with Jeff and Patrick, let's get an overview of where we are right now with the election outcome. Let's start with the House of Representatives. The Republicans are projected to win back the majority in the House. As of now, the majority is still unclear, though, as I've mentioned at the beginning. In order to control the House, the Republicans would need 218 seats. That's 9 seats more than they have right now. The Democrats have 191 seats right now. They would need 27 additional seats for the majority. As of this morning, there are 35 uncalled House races based on the vote count. The Democrats lead in 24 of them, while the Republicans lead in 11.
Now, going into the midterms, it was clear that the Senate race would be very competitive. 35 seats stood for election. Democrats made the first Senate pickup as they fought to defend their majority in Pennsylvania. Still up for grabs, however, are Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. Now, only in recent weeks were Republicans able to gain momentum and improve their chances to win back the majority by shifting their focus of their campaigns on the economy. Given surging inflation, economic concerns seem to be more potent than the social ones, such as the discussion over reproductive rights, which had provided the Democrats with a boost earlier on in their campaign. Right now, the Republicans need 51 seats for a majority in the Senate, but it's unclear if they'll be able to pick up the 2 additional seats they'll need for this majority. It looks as though they might be able to still pick up Nevada, where they're currently leading. But with neither candidate pulling over 50% in Georgia, it looks as though Georgia will be heading to a runoff election in December.
The race in Georgia was between the incumbent Democrat Reverend Raphael Warnock and Republican challenger Herschel Walker. This is the first Senate race in history between 2 African-American candidates. Walker is a former football star and personal friend of Donald Trump. Earlier this fall, he was most likely to lose, actually. His campaign was plagued by several controversies. Nonetheless, Walker was able to improve his chances enormously in the last few weeks before the election.
Looking to Nevada, incumbent Senator Catherine Cortez Masto faced off against Republican Adam Laxalt. Now, along with Georgia, Nevada was also an incredibly competitive race. Cortez Masto ran a campaign based on affordable health care and defending abortion rights. Her challenger Laxalt, however, focused his campaign on reducing government spending and inflation, as well as combating illegal immigration.
In Pennsylvania, the Republican incumbent didn't run for re-election. The 2 candidates facing one another were Republican TV personality Mehmet Oz, the TV doctor, as he's called sometimes here in the US, and Democrat John Fetterman. Oz is a political newcomer and was endorsed by Donald Trump. After a turbulent campaign, Fetterman was able to pull ahead and flip the seats for the Democrats.
Now, Arizona, another battleground state, will be decided between Democratic incumbent Mark Kelly and Republican Blake Masters. The prior astronaut Kelly seemed to have fallen slightly behind Masters, the former president of the Thiel Foundation, but for now, Kelly is pulling ahead of his opponent. Kelly is a distinctive political figure known for his bipartisanship in Congress, whereas Masters, a Trump supporter, campaigned to oust the quote-unquote same old establishment politicians.
This election, as I mentioned, wasn't only about Congress. Many states voted on their governors, and here we also had some nail-biting races. Currently, the US states are governed by 28 Republican and 22 Democratic governors. As expected, Democrats were able to flip the governorship in Massachusetts and Maryland. In Nevada, on the other hand, the Republican candidate was able to take over from the Democratic incumbent. In Oregon, Democrat Tina Kotek, a former State House Speaker, ran against Christine Drazan from the Republicans. As of 9:30 p.m. last night, Kotek was leading by a slim margin. Yet more than 20% of the votes have yet to be counted. Kansas was interesting. In the election campaign, Democratic incumbent and winner Laura Kelly avoided the issue of abortion rights and instead focused on the economy and education policy. The 2 topics usually dominated by the Republicans. Arizona was also a tight race between Republican Kari Lake running against Democrat Katie Hobbs, the state's incumbent Secretary of State. Kari Lake, who was strongly supported by Donald Trump, focused her campaign largely on accusations that Democrats, quote unquote, stole the 2020 presidential elections.
Now, turning to the governor races, As expected, in Georgia, incumbent Brian Kemp won. He was the first governor to reopen during the COVID-19 pandemic and resisted Trump's pressure campaign to overturn the Georgia election results in 2020. His opponent was the prominent advocate, Democrat Stacey Abrams. Kemp's victory could potentially boost fellow Republican Herschel Walker's chances to win a seat in the Senate in the upcoming runoff elections that we expect to take place on December 6th. However, this is not a given. Turning to Florida, there was also no doubt that incumbent Governor Ron DeSantis would be reelected. His reelection, however, is quite significant for us. If he decides to run for president in 2024, he's considered the primary Republican challenger to the presidential bid by Donald Trump.
Having just touched on a few highlights, you can see we have a lot to discuss. Let's dive into the analysis and consult our experts, Jeffrey Cabaservice and Patrick Ruffini. Patrick, let's start with you. In their campaigns, the Republicans focused on economy, crime, migration, inflation, whereas for the Democrats, abortion rights, healthcare, gun laws, and the future of democracy were pretty high on the agenda. A lot of people thought, at least during the last few years, weeks before the election, that the Democrats might have chosen the wrong topics. Would you agree or not? I mean, how would you say, did the topics impact these elections?
Absolutely. So, inflation and the economy definitely created the environment where Republicans could make gains, that this would ultimately be the kind of midterm election like that reflects what we normally see in midterm elections, where the party in power loses seats. And add to that a dismal situation with inflation, add to that very challenging economic statistics, falling real wages. And you could see where it would not be just a let's say collapse in the traditional midterm collapse for the incumbent party, but it could be an absolute blowout, similar to what we maybe saw in 2010, where Democrats lost 63 seats. In the summer, we had the Roe versus Wade reversal happen. Immediately following that, we went from primaries, so we had primaries all throughout the year, and we could measure the primaries before that decision happened to after that decision happening. And in primaries before the Roe versus Wade reversal, Republicans were outvoting Democrats by 7 points. And this is important because this is historically been almost a nearly perfect measure of how the fall election will turn out. After the Roe versus Wade decision, Republicans were only outvoting Democrats by 1 point in those primaries. And it looks like we will end up something close to there in the House popular vote, which is going to probably, it stands at Republicans +5 now, but with all the mail-in ballots that Democrats have primarily used after the 2020 election and the pandemic, it appears that that margin will narrow to somewhere in the range of 2 points. So it is very much of a, number one, a post-Roe political environment where Democrats too had something to fight for. In a traditional midterm, there really isn't much the in-party can do to reverse these dynamics. And these dynamics were very present in the off-year elections in Virginia and New Jersey a year ago, where Republicans picked up a state that had gone for Joe Biden by 10 points in Virginia with Glenn Youngkin. So there are two factors, though, that I think predominantly weigh. So now we are looking at a very narrow Republican victory in the House. Some very disappointing, frankly, results for Republicans in the Senate in terms of not being on track to pick up either the main three states, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. They've obviously already lost Pennsylvania. Georgia is headed to a runoff, but it appears that Herschel Walker will have won the vote by about 1 point. Raphael Warnock will have won the vote by about 1 point in Georgia. And based on the mail-in ballots that have been already received in Nevada, it looks like Nevada may be trending towards Democrats. So, but by a very, very narrow margin. So they fall just short in really I would argue would be the only three true battlegrounds. This is the narrowest Senate battleground, and Republicans have been shut out. So the two factors for why the lack of a Republican wave, I think, first of all, the Roe decision shifted the political environment, but also the fact that Donald Trump was extremely successful. The Trump factor cannot be ignored here. Now, he was extremely successful in picking candidates in the primaries who have mostly gone on to lose in competitive races. Maybe Republicans were assuming that this would be such a great year that they could take liberties with the kinds of candidates that they selected, that they did not need to select necessarily the most appealing candidates, but maybe they could select candidates that were in the mold of Donald Trump, who were more combative, more partisan, and also repeated, because this was a criteria for Donald Trump in selecting his candidates, who were more likely to repeat his narrative about the stolen 2020 election. In those cases where candidates took a very, very hardline stance on that the 2020 election was stolen early in the primary, that would include General Don Bolduc in New Hampshire, Doug Mastriano, the candidate for governor in Pennsylvania, and to some extent Blake Masters in Arizona. Though all of those candidates underperformed the partisan fundamentals, Masters not by as much, but specifically in Pennsylvania and New Hampshire, we're going to see those candidates go down to pretty sizable defeats. So it's very clear that Republicans underperformed on the candidate front. Contrast that with Ron DeSantis in Florida, winning his election by almost 20 points, really creating the only real Republican bright spot of the evening. And DeSantis looks like he's in a much better, he's in about as strong a position he could be to run for president and challenge Trump. And Trump is wounded right now because of this this track record that turns out to have been pretty decisive in a lot of these very competitive elections.
Thank you. Well, Jeff, if I could switch gears just a little bit. We have a debate in this country on whether or not the state of the U.S. democracy is in peril. The New York Times recently reported that voters overwhelmingly do believe so, but they're pretty apathetic about it. Why is that?
Thank you, Sarita. Nice to see you and Paul and Patrick. Nice to be here with you as well. Before I get to the question about democracy on trial, so to speak, let me just speak for a moment as a historian, because I think it's important for particularly European viewers to understand that this is a very historically unusual result for a midterm election. This is actually the most successful performance for a president in a midterm election since 2002, despite the fact that Joe Biden is actually unpopular. His popularity ratings hovered about 40% approval, so that means a majority disapprove of his performance.
And just to add on that, Jeff, and
yes.
We have to bear in mind that 2002 was just after the 9/11 attacks, so it was quite a special situation for the US.
Absolutely, yes. So this is not what the fundamentals, as we call it, would predict for the election outcome. As Patrick mentioned so well, we would have expected a big Republican tsunami, perhaps, or at least a wave. And instead, it looks like there will only be a narrow majority in the House. And as you just described, the Senate is still very much up for grabs. But, one of the other unusual factors here is Donald Trump, the defeated former president, intervening directly in the Republican primary elections earlier this year. That also has never happened before. The only historical parallel I could even grasp at would go back to the early 20th century when former President Theodore Roosevelt tried to take the Republican Party in a different direction and eventually ended running a third-party campaign. So this is just very unusual. And as Patrick said, Donald Trump imposed some candidates on the Republican Party who turned out to be fairly weak, in some cases just daft. And this is because Donald Trump was picking on his own criteria for what determines political success. He thinks it's celebrity and fame and attractiveness. This turned out not to be completely accurate. And his main criteria for what defines a good Republican in Donald Trump's standing is whether they are loyal to his big lie of the stolen 2020 election. And so I don't think it was unrealistic to feel that democracy is under threat in the United States, particularly since a lot of those state-level elections that you mentioned will put people into power who have an opportunity to determine the outcome of the election despite the Democratic vote count. And that's a worrying prospect. But I think actually that the outcome of this election is actually good for American democracy, because although the New York Times article that you mentioned created a lot of upset because it seemed like Americans care about democracy in an abstract sense, but didn't want to vote on it, that in fact, democracy actually was more important in what voters were looking for in this election than some of those stories might suggest. So although the economy was what voters in exit polls cited as being their top concern, more than half said that was their most important issue, about 44% in the most recent poll that I saw said that democracy and its preservation was actually very important to them as their top issue. Of course, there is some partisan correlation with this. If you were going to say that that was the most important issue, then you were going almost certainly to vote Democrat. If you said that democracy was not important, you were almost certainly going to vote Republican. And as it turns out, a lot of the sort of most prominent election deniers did not win office. And in fact, being an election denier, particularly an outright person who says that Joe Biden is not legitimately elected president in 2020, that actually seemed to hurt your totals more than just a regular normal Republican would have been expected to perform. And I think, it's very hard to interpret the results of these elections because, again, they are so different from the fundamentals, and we don't yet have, I think, accurate data on what voters had in mind as they went to the polling place. But certainly there seems to be a fear on the part of a lot of voters that Republicans will bring chaos to the act of governing, both in Congress, and then also Donald Trump would bring a lot of chaos just to the mere fact of campaigning for the president, let alone being reelected as president. And so what you actually saw is an almost complete repudiation of particularly those Secretary of State positions where election deniers were running. I think the worst of them, such as Mark Fincham in Arizona, Jim Marchant in Nevada, did not actually win election. And although there are certainly some election deniers who did win office, I think it's relatively few who are in a position to actually directly interfere with the election at that state level in those critical positions. So I think on the whole, democracy in America is still in decent shape, but obviously a bit threatened as we go into what are bound to be an extremely divisive and chaotic second half of Joe Biden's presidency.
Jeff, thank you also for giving us a glimpse on what was actually going on in previous decades. Thank you so much for that. But Patrick, we spoke about Trump now already several times, or in your answer, in Jeff's answer. But what about Biden? Midterm elections in the US usually are also considered a referendum about the job performance of the incumbent president. And Joe Biden's approval ratings were not really high. It was between 40 and 45%. So is that also a peculiarity during this midterms that it didn't really, at least so much, affect the outcome?
Well, when the other side is doing a good enough job of digging its own grave, you don't want to do anything to get in the way. And what Republicans did and what Donald Trump did was get in the way of that. So in a traditional midterm, it is true that, and I think, Jeff was very astute in pointing out that this situation is almost without precedent. Republicans in general, did not need to call attention to themselves in this campaign. They only needed to point out the situation with inflation, with gas prices. And instead, what we had was a balance right here of negatives on both sides. So you had both a situation with inflation and gas prices that was that should have spelled doom for the Democratic Party. But I think the issue of democracy manifested more in the character and the, let's say, perceptions of the extremism of Republican candidates. So when candidates are perceived as more ideologically extreme, they lose votes. When candidates are perceived as pursuing sort of these chaotic, or either perceived as personally kind of chaotic, a little bit off the rails, like we saw in Georgia, like we saw in the cases of a lot of these election deniers, they lose votes. The same thing would be true of Democrats. So Democratic candidates that were successfully tagged with the protests that happened in 2020, the defund the police movement that happened in 2020, or taking a position for Medicare for all, for instance, lost about on an average of 5 points compared to candidates who took more moderate positions. In the Republican primary this year, specifically, it was that issue of the election denial that even not all Republicans were on board with. And I think that's an important point to stress, that even though a majority of Republicans did not believe Joe Biden was legitimately elected, about a third of Republicans did not, but did actually believe Biden was legitimately elected. And it appears as though, Republicans may have lost more of their voters than Democrats lost of their own voters in this election. So I believe the exit poll, both exit polls had Republicans up 3 or 4 in the, let's say, party identification, which is quite a good Republican electorate. So you look at Florida specifically, your Democratic turnout collapse. In many ways, this was a good Republican year. Republicans will have won the House vote, which I don't believe they have done since at least 2016. And so it was in many ways quite a good Republican performance. But a couple of things, both the perceptions, I think the perceptions of extremism and chaos really got in the way of driving that message. Normally, what you would expect to see in a midterm is basically the incumbent party matching the vote share, matching Biden's job approval, matching the job approval of the incumbent president, which was about 45, 46%. Instead, they got a boost of about 2, 3, 4 points above Biden's approval rating, because Trump specifically created an alternative that was worse in the minds of very many voters, instead of just letting inflation and the economy really drive the narrative.
Perhaps one follow-up question, Patrick. So we've mentioned Trump, we've mentioned Biden, but when it comes to the first 2 years of the Biden administrations, a lot of major legislation has passed Congress: the Infrastructure Investment Act, the American Rescue Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, an act for the veterans' healthcare. There was major legislation. But you wouldn't say that impacted the question on how Republicans voted this time?
I think that those accomplishments were certainly important legislatively. I don't think they were a huge vote driver. I think ultimately, the personality, both the personality of Trump, the sort of broader perceptions, at least in not figuring very much in a lot of the advertising in the campaign. And that's usually the best reflection of what parties think are going to be winning issues for them. So on the Democratic side, you had a lot of ads about abortion. You had a lot of ads about election denial. On the Republican side, you had a lot of ads about crime, a lot of ads about inflation, and relatively little about the Biden's legislative agenda. We tested this question, right? We tested this in September. We did a national poll where we really kind of try to get people's reactions to most of the arguments that both parties were making. And Republican arguments on inflation, on the economy, did prove most persuasive. But But I was surprised by the extent to which a message about Biden's historic accomplishments, his legislative agenda, did not actually move voters very much in the election. I do think that in a time when people themselves are feeling they're having trouble putting food on the table, they're not really seeing the benefits. So I think a lot of this touting of accomplishments does not come across as very credible to voters. And what ultimately proved more effective for Democrats is just calling attention to the extremism, to the election denial, to those issues.
If I could follow up, Patrick, could you provide us with insights on how independents and other minorities, especially the African American community and Hispanic minorities, voted? And yeah, you could just take us.
Of course, yeah. So there was a lot of hope. So I think that there's both a mix of good, I think still a mix of good and bad news. So in Florida, it appears like Ron DeSantis and Marco Rubio will have done quite well with the Hispanic vote, including among Hispanic communities that have not traditionally voted Republican, such as the Puerto Rican community in Central Florida. Both DeSantis and Rubio winning Osceola County, really the epicenter of that community. For the first time, a Republican has done that in quite a bit. Along the U.S.-Mexico border in South Texas, Republicans were hoping to pick up as many as 3 newly drawn House seats with Hispanic female candidates. It only appears that they will have picked up 1 of those seats, and although they will have outperformed Donald Trump's margins in the 2020 election in at least 2 of those seats. So the lack of, underperformance was a little bit disappointing. Nonetheless, Republicans seem to have consolidated most of their gains in that region, which was such a focus after the 2020 election, because it had gone from being a place where Democrats routinely won with 70–80% of the vote to a very swing region where Republicans had the opportunity to actually win congressional seats, which they hadn't done in over 100 years. So it was going to be a very historic moment if they did that. Nonetheless, at least in the national exit polls right now, the Republican margin with Hispanics will, it looks like they have made further gains on top of what was perceived as being Donald Trump's successful performance in the 2020 election. I believe the AP Votecast has the margin at 16 points. The traditional exit poll has it at 21 points. Traditionally, for a community that has gone about 70–30 Democratic, that is quite a good outcome for Republicans. You also see gains with the African American vote. Republicans look like they have won 13–14% of the African American vote, which does not seem very high at all. However, the number in previous midterms was between 9% and 10%. So this sort of hope for, let's say, a multiracial working class party, right? It does appear that Republicans did make some gains there, but I think they were obscured by the results of individual races. And there were only a certain number of races that were competitive where that, let's say, that coalition comes into play.
Well, one of the issue, of course, which might, I could call it a long-term trend, is the question of what constituencies are actually contested. Let's take the House, 435 constituencies in the US. And according to, there's different numbers, but some people say that actually there's less and less contested constituencies, 60 in some analysis. Sometimes when it comes to really toss-up constituencies, Cook Report, for example, said just before the election, there was just 31 really toss-up constituencies, which is a trend insofar as this is pretty much influenced also by, let's say, having all districts, having all constituencies being redistricted every 10-year census. So Jeff, what do we see? Do we have to expect these slim margins in very interesting constituency be the future of US elections? And perhaps the second question based on that, there is a lot of people who said that actually the really contested constituencies are in suburbs. Would you agree to that?
Thanks, Paul. I do think that actually the outcomes of the last several elections at the House level have shifted back and forth, depending on the outcomes in a relative handful of districts. Now, why aren't most districts competitive? To some extent, we hear a lot about gerrymandering, which is the process by which politicians use computer software to, in effect, design their own districts to assure the most favorable outcomes for themselves. And this is a phenomenon that has been in American politics since the 18th century. But I think, there's also an important factor, which is that Americans are sorting themselves into more homogeneous districts. One of the weaknesses that Democrats face is that so many of their constituencies are packed into urban areas, especially, that their votes are, in a sense, superfluous and wasted when it comes to a lot of these contests. So what's going on in the suburbs? I think that what I've seen is a lot of suburbs that tend to have a lot of college-educated people and professionals have been shifting back and forth in the last several elections. Democrats won them in 2018, which was part of their big wave election. They gave up a lot of those seats in 2020, which was a surprise, given that they had expected to actually build on their gains in the House. And now it seems that they're going to have shown some more strength than expected in those suburbs in this election. So what's going on? Well, I think, again, to look at an interesting historic statistic, in the exit polls, they will ask people, do you strongly support the president, somewhat support the president, somewhat disapprove of the president, or strongly disapprove of the president? And what's interesting there is the category of somewhat disapprove. Typically, if the voter will disapprove of the president, then they will actually go against the president and against his party by 20 percentage points or more. In this case, those somewhat disapprove voters seem to have voted for the Democrats by 5%. So this is just a result which completely contradicts the results of decades worth of experience of polling. And I think the reason for this is that, particularly for those voters in the suburbs, they're very cross-pressured. They are not happy with the Democrats for any number of reasons. You talk about Ron DeSantis. Part of the reason I think that he has been successful is because Florida was one of the states that was perceived to have been the most open during the pandemic. And generally speaking, a lot of voters do not like their schools to be closed. We've seen record learning losses as a result of the pandemic. Obviously, people whose jobs depend on businesses being open were also very unhappy about pandemic closures. And of course, a lot of these voters in the suburbs are also feeling the inflation, the bad economy, and crime. This is not a manufactured issue. I think crime is actually a real worry for many Americans. But at the same time, a lot of these very same voters who are unhappy about things the Democrats are doing turned around and looked at the Republican Party and didn't like a Donald Trump-dominated Republican Party, which is saying crazy things, particularly about the elections, and just doesn't seem to be interested in governing or worthy of trusting with power. So I think what you're seeing is just this very cross-pressured electorate, which is unhappy with both parties. I think this was an election which really demonstrated the power of negative partisanship, which is where you don't really much like your party, but you really don't like the other party, and you're determined to deny them an opportunity to do what they want when they're in power, which in some cases means a rise of ticket splitting, which is a phenomenon we haven't seen much in a while. So I think the end result is we're a deeply divided country and a narrowly divided country. And we're going to see the next Congress as a chaotic and largely dysfunctional demonstration of America's difficulty when it comes to governing itself.
So thanks, Jeff. If I could just follow up on that, as you mentioned, division is the theme. So it looks, like we'll have a divided government in Washington, but what do you think this means for the relationship between the administration and Congress moving forward, especially when it comes to the domestic policy agenda? And also, do you think it will be possible to find for, the administration and Congress to find common ground, and on what topics?
I think it's going to be very difficult for the administration and Congress to find ground, particularly if, as we anticipate, it's going to be a Republican-controlled House. And actually, part of the problem is somewhat ironically going to be that Republicans didn't win the House by a big margin, as they had anticipated. If there had been a big Republican wave that brought in 10, 20, 30 more Republican seats, a lot of those seats would have come from fairly blue or at least purple districts, and you would have expected those legislators to be at least somewhat moderate. As it stands now, the House Freedom Caucus, which is in many ways the most extreme faction in the House, and individual chaos merchants like Marjorie Taylor Greene are going to have a lot of leverage on Kevin McCarthy, even assuming that Kevin McCarthy manages to win election as Speaker. And actors like Marjorie Taylor Greene are going to push Kevin McCarthy into some extreme and probably unwise actions. Of course, we're all worried about things like, for example, Republicans trying to shut down the government again, as they have done in the past, in a hope to pressure Joe Biden into cutting government spending or doing any number of things that they seek. There's going to be a number of circus-like investigations of the administration, some of which may be useful when it comes to determining what went wrong with our withdrawal from Afghanistan last year, or perhaps also how the pandemic was handled, but a lot of which are just going to be partisan circuses, such as investigations into Hunter Biden's laptop, or attempts to impeach various Biden cabinet officials, or to impeach Biden himself. I think ultimately this will be bad for the Republicans because it will strengthen the public perception that they are just chaos merchants and not to be trusted with power. That might be good for Democrats in 2024. But in the near term, I think that will really call into question a lot of Biden's ability to get any significant legislation passed. But on the other hand, if I could qualify that with one more point, I do actually believe that a lot of work gets done in Congress still behind the scenes in what some commentators have called the secret Congress. And I think that a number of the Republicans who came into office in this election, as well as some of those who are still there, do not really believe in the big lie. They're not interested in being obstructionists. They actually want to get some things done to address the problems the country does have. And they will cooperate with Democrats on some issues, as they have through this past term, on issues like infrastructure and the manufacturing of semiconductors, issues that are not really hugely partisan and sort of drawn into the sort of media spotlight. So I'm hopeful that some things will still get done in the second half of the Biden administration, but I don't think they will be the sort of high-profile legislation that we've seen some examples of so far.
Yeah, thank you so much. But now we spoke about Congress, what is going on in Congress, but and we touched upon the issue briefly. And we unfortunately we have only 5 more minutes. I know it's a complicated question, but Patrick, we've mentioned already that among the Democrats or the people voting for the Democrats, or we could say or could we say the Democrats become something like the white-collar, young, more diverse, urban party. The Republicans is developing as a blue-collar, rather countryside, older, whiter, more male party in the future. And what kind of changes do you expect? Let's start with the Democrats from this kind of possible distinction between these two parties.
Well, I would add a little twist to that characterization of the Republicans, because I think if that were actually the Republican coalition moving forward, which it looked like it could be in 2016, right? Going back to 2016, it looked like Trump was activating really some darker tendencies in the electorate around immigration, around opposition to refugees, around really doubling down on this nativist strategy that would appeal only to white working class voters and no one else. And it turns out that Trump's ideas, Trump's personality, moreover, appealed more also to Hispanics, also to a small number of African Americans who have shifted over, and has created the opportunity, an opportunity I will write about in a forthcoming book, for Republicans to become this sort of multiracial party of the people, to consolidate some measure of the old FDR coalition for the Democrats, which united minority voters and united working class white voters, including groups of people who were very opposed to one another, white Southerners and African Americans. Now, I don't think we'll see anything close to, let's say, Republicans winning a majority of the non-white vote. But I think you'll see that these non-white voters actually share a lot in common with white working class voters in terms of they really care about the economy. I was just in South Texas a couple of weeks ago, and the economy was really dominant as an issue. Also, the issue of immigration was not something that was, let's say, was a negative for Republicans among these Hispanic voters who have seen a lot of chaos at the border with this surge in migration. In one county I was at, over 400,000 people had crossed over the border and passed over the border. I do think that we are seeing shifts in the party coalitions, including in a state like Florida, which is a very, very diverse state, and now is looking to be at least one of the really kind of the citadel of the Republican Party nationally, which used to be in Texas, right? Used to be Texas. It was the biggest large Republican state. Now Florida, in this election, has been solidified as, I think, an almost unassailable Republican fortress that includes a lot of minority voters, not just Cuban Americans, but Puerto Ricans, Venezuelans, and a sizable Black community and a sizable community of migrants from the Caribbean.
I might add, Georgia is also a very interesting case where things are no longer that much clear-cut as perhaps in previous years. We just came back from Georgia a few days ago. We've been there for a visiting program, and you could feel how many people moved to Georgia, how many companies moved to Georgia. The Hispanic community is pretty strong, but also when it comes to political opinions, pretty diverse. The African community, it's also a little bit more complicated than perhaps it was during the previous 10 years.
I think in particular in Georgia, what's happening in Georgia, which is very interesting, is it has practically become, it has attracted a lot of migration from Black voters out of state moving into Georgia, particularly in the outer ring of the Atlanta suburbs. It is practically, I would say, the capital of Black America right now in terms of having the most African-American voters of any state. And that has really shifted that state into the battleground category.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time for our discussion today, but before we leave this meeting, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to Jeff Cabaservice and Patrick Ruffini for joining our discussion today. Thank you for being candid with us and providing us with this excellent source of information. We're so glad you were able to join us. Thank you also very much to our viewers from Europe and the US. We were glad to have you with us today. Coming up shortly, we will begin part 2 of our U.S. midterm discussion and debrief and outlook. Please stay with us for the European perspective on the U.S. midterms. For that, we'll be turning it over to our colleagues in Brussels. So if you haven't registered for that yet, please take the opportunity now to follow this link where you can register last minute.
Thank you so much. See you in 10 minutes.
Bye-bye.